Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. There are places in this world where the maps lie to you, where the trails you've walked 100 times suddenly shift their weight in the dark. We like to believe that civilization has pushed the dark back, that concrete, GPS satellites, and deadbolt locks have made us safe. But if you stand out on a mountain ridge at 2 in the morning, when the temperature drops below freezing, and the silence gets so heavy you can hear your own pulse in your pillow, you realize something terrifying. We were never the observers. We were standing in the funnel all along. Tonight, we are journeying deep into 10 of the most disturbing, bone-chilling true encounters ever recorded in the isolated hollows of Appalachia, deep national forests, abandoned industrial night shifts, and dark mountain passes. From trail cameras capturing impossible bipedal shapes running at 15 miles an hour on frozen ground to entities pacing campsites while mimicking human speech, these stories will make you question every locked door in your house. Before we begin, check your locks, turn off the lights, and if you hear someone whispering your name from the tree line outside your window, do not answer. Let us descend into the dark. I have not worn shoes inside my own house since November, and I need to explain that before the words stop being mine. My name does not matter much out here. What matters is that I own 300 acres in Buchanan County, Virginia, that the nearest neighbor is 4 ridges away, and that on a Saturday morning I sat at my kitchen table with a memory card in my laptop and found 3 photographs that took something out of me I have not been able to put back. They were taken 1 second apart. 2:23 in the morning, 27 degrees, a Tuesday in the middle of the rut. After 8 years of watching this land through infrared eyes, I know exactly what belongs in that gap, and what came through it that night was not on the list. The property sits between 2 ridges, a creek at the bottom, slopes climbing 500 feet on either side. At the south end, the ridges lean toward each other and leave a saddle, maybe 50 yards of level ground, and everything that moves in these mountains uses it. Deer, bear, coyote, bobcat. The terrain gives them no choice. My grandfather bought this land in 1953. My father hunted that saddle every November of his life, and 11 years ago they found him up on the North Ridge in the cold, and I still have not moved his boots off the porch. I keep telling myself I will. They are stiff as fired clay now, laces frozen in the last knot he tied. I run 12 cameras. The one in the gap is mounted 4 feet up on a beech tree, on an old square-cut nail my grandfather drove into that trunk before I was born, which I always thought was strange because a nail like that has no business in a live tree. That camera has produced more images than the other 11 combined. It fires a burst of 3 when something trips the sensor, 1 frame per second, and it stamps every frame with the temperature, the moon phase, and the battery level. That last number is the boring one. That last number is the one that eventually stopped making sense. The card that November held about 400 images, 2 weeks of ordinary traffic, and I scrolled it the way you scroll anything familiar, half watching coffee going cold, doe, turkey, coyote. Then the timestamp read 2D314 and the frame was full of bodies. Not deer, upright bipedal, smeared across the image because they were moving faster than the shutter could hold them, and even smeared I could count at least 4, maybe 5, running single file through the saddle from south to north. They were leaning. That was the first thing my brain refused. A sprinter leans, sure, but these torsos were pitched almost level with the ground, so far forward that gravity should have driven their faces into the rock, and they were not falling. They were being carried by their own speed like a bicycle that stays up, only because it refuses to stop. Their arms were not pumping. Their arms were stretched out ahead of them, longer than the torsos should have allowed, reaching for something in the dark that the camera could not see. And they were bare. No clothing, no packs, no lights, nothing but the flat gray of skin in infrared, 27 degrees on frozen ground. 4 bodies moving through my gap at roughly 15 miles an hour, with their heads thrust forward on their necks like animals following a scent line down a trail they had run 1,000 times before. The third frame caught only the last one leaving, legs at the right edge, and I zoomed until the pixels came apart. The foot was striking flat, the toes were splayed wide, spread like a hand gripping a ledge, and the sole was thick and dark the way a hoof is dark, the way skin gets when it has been walked into leather over years. That is not a foot that took its boots off for one night. That is a foot that has forgotten boots exist. I showed the pictures to exactly one person, a man named Cal Mullins, who has logged more of these hollows than anyone alive. He held my laptop for a long time and finally said they could be runners, could be hikers, could be kids on something. Then he handed it back and did not touch his coffee again, and when he left he asked me, casually, if my father had ever mentioned anything about the gap. I said no. That was the first lie I told about all this, and it came out of me smooth as water. I started checking the card every week, then twice a week, 8 months, and the camera gave me nothing but deer and a bobcat with a torn ear, and I began doing something I want you to understand as clearly as I can. I stopped hoping they would not come back. I started hoping they would. My wife has been gone 9 years. My son calls at Christmas, and up here the silence gets so complete you can hear your own pulse in the pillow, and those 4 bodies were the first thing in a decade that had wanted something badly enough to run for it. Then the battery numbers started lying. Fresh lithiums, rated for a year, and the gap camera would drain to nothing in 11 days, while the identical unit 600 yards north stayed at 94%. 3 separate times I pulled a card and found a hole in the record, 40 minutes of night simply absent, the timestamp stepping from 2:04 to 2:44 with no trigger between them, which is not a thing that camera does, and every one of those gaps swallowed 2:23. In March, I went out at first light after a hard frost and found the trail through the saddle printed clean in the white. Bare feet, not one set. They came through in file, heel strike flat, toes spread so wide the outer prints looked more like a splayed palm than anything that should be attached to a leg. I followed them north, and about 40 feet past the beach they stopped. Not turned. Stopped, all of them, facing back toward the camera, standing in the frost for however long it takes to melt a print into a shallow bowl. Then the tracks resumed. The camera had recorded nothing at all that night. I stopped sleeping right after that. Not insomnia, something worse. I would go to bed at 11 and wake at 2:23 with the covers thrown back and the front door standing open on the cold, and one morning there was creek grit in my sheets and both my heels were cut and the cuts were already scabbed, which takes a day, and it had been 3 hours. My boots were on the porch beside my father's, laces tied, untouched. Clean, so on the last Friday in April, I did the only thing I could think of. I turned the gap camera around. I aimed it back down the trail toward my own cabin. Along the route a man would take walking south in the dark, and I set the burst to 5 frames, and I went to bed with the door dead bolted and the key in my pocket. I woke at 6:40 in my own bed. The dead bolt was thrown. The key was in my pocket, warm, and there were 41 images on the card. 40 of them were nothing, wind and shifting branches. The 41st was time-stamped 2:23:9, 29 degrees, battery at 4%, and it showed a man standing in the middle of the trail about 20 feet from the lens, barefoot, in the flannel shirt I had gone to sleep in. He was leaning forward, not falling, not walking, held at that impossible angle, arms already beginning to stretch out ahead of him, head pushed forward on the neck, face tilted down toward the ground, like something reading the earth. I have looked at that photograph more times than I have looked at my son's wedding pictures, and every time I notice the same detail last, because my mind keeps hiding it from me. Behind me in the frame, back at the edge of the infrared, 4 more shapes were waiting, not moving, waiting for the slow one. They found my father on the North Ridge in November with his boots sitting side by side down at the creek, 60 feet apart, laces tied. Exposure, the coroner wrote, though he had been in those mountains 50 years and knew better than anyone how to not die in them. What nobody put in the report, what I only remembered this spring when the memory came back up through me like cold water, is that the man at the funeral home said the soles of his feet were the strangest he had ever seen. Thick as saddle leather, toes spread wide, permanently, like they had grown into the shape of grabbing. My father wore steel toes 6 days a week and had not gone barefoot outdoors since childhood. He was 58 years old, and something had been running him for years. My grandfather drove that square nail into a live beech in the 50s, and I have finally understood that he was not marking timber. He was marking the place where they come through, and every man in my line since has sat on the edge of that saddle in the dark, calling it hunting, telling himself he was the one watching. We were never the observers. We were standing in the funnel. That is what a funnel is for. The terrain gives them no choice but to pass through it, and it gave us no choice about being there when they did. I do not know where they are going. That is the part that keeps me up, more than the rest of it. They come from the south drainage and cross into the north, and they run like something is either behind them or waiting ahead, and I have walked both directions for miles and found nothing but rhododendron and rock. I still cannot count them for certain. 4, possibly 5. Some nights I look at that first blurred frame from 2022, and I am convinced the 5th one is smaller, slower, trailing, and I think about the fact that my father had been running with them for 11 years before I ever pulled that card, and I wonder which of those shapes was waiting on me in April. So here's what my life is now. The cameras are all pointed at the gap again, all 12 of them, because I want to see it happen. My boots sit on the porch next to his, and the laces have gone stiff in the last knot I tied. And last week I tried to put them on, and my feet no longer fit inside them, the toes gone wide and flat and hard against the leather. I have not worn shoes inside my own house since November, and now I cannot wear them outside it either. And the strange thing, the thing I would not admit to Cal or my son or the coroner, is that the floorboards feel good under me, and the frost feels better. The gap is still open, the camera is still watching. And one of these nights, when the temperature drops and the moon is thin, I will not be the one checking the card. I have counted things my whole life, ever since my father taught me that a number is the one thing fear cannot bend out of shape. At 1:22 in the morning, in the back country of the Cherokee National Forest, I lay in my tent and counted 5 separate breathing things in the creek bed below our camp, and none of them were mine, and none of them belonged to Marcus or Eric. 5 is a number I have not been able to make peace with since. This was supposed to be an ordinary weekend, the same October ritual we had kept for a decade, 3 men in their 30s pretending the woods could still make us young. What I never told them was the real reason I picked that creek. My father used to bring me to this exact drainage before the cancer took the strength out of his hands. He called it the good water, the place where the trout ran small but plentiful, and he told me once, half joking, that he and 3 other men had stacked the fire ring at that campsite themselves, decades earlier, from stones they carried up from the creek one at a time. I chose that site because it was the last place I remembered feeling like his son, instead of the man who signed his hospice paperwork. I never said that part out loud to Marcus or Eric. I let them believe it was just a good spot, level ground, water access, isolation. We arrived Wednesday and set up with the efficiency of men who have done this too many times to think about it. Tents in a loose triangle, bear bags hung high, the cook kit arranged on the same flat rock my father used to use for his. The first 2 nights were exactly what I wanted them to be. We fished, we ate, we sat by the fire until the cold pushed us into our sleeping bags, and the forest kept the particular quiet that October produces. Insects gone, frogs silent, nothing but water over stone and the occasional owl. I fell asleep those 2 nights the way I had not slept in months, without dreaming about hospital rooms. The 3rd night, I woke without a sound to wake me. That is the part I still cannot explain cleanly. Not a snapped branch, not a scream, just an instant and total alertness, the kind that comes from somewhere beneath thought, and I checked my watch out of the same old habit my father drilled into me, and it read 1:22. I lay still and listened, and underneath the creek's steady murmur was another sound layered on top of it, low and rhythmic, coming from 30 yards downhill where the rhododendron grew thick along the banks. Breathing. Not one animal's breathing. Several, positioned at different distances, heavy and rapid, like something that had recently been running or waiting. I did the math the way you do when your body has already decided something your mind is still catching up to. The creek bottom was the only approach to our camp. the single corridor between us and the trail out. Whatever was breathing down there in the dark was sitting directly on top of the only way home. I heard a zipper before I heard anything else move, slow and careful, failing at quiet the way zippers always do. Then another, from the far side of camp. Marcus and Eric had woken at the same moment I had, pulled up out of sleep by whatever the forest had changed, and none of us called out. That still sits wrong with me. The normal thing is to ask, to say your friend's name into the dark and hear him answer. Instead, all three of us went silent at once, as if some older instinct than friendship had told us that announcing ourselves was the one mistake we could not undo. The breathing kept its rhythm for a while, and then the feet started. Water displaced around ankles, gravel shifting under weight, slow and deliberate, moving not toward the tents but along the creek, parallel to the slope, like something pacing a line it had already decided not to cross. Between the footsteps, I caught fragments of sound that were not breathing, and were not animal calls either, short guttural exhalations with tonal shape to them, rising and falling with intent. Every time one of those sounds cut through the dark, the movement in the creek bed shifted, changed direction, adjusted pace, as if the sound had been an instruction and the feet had understood it. I have never been able to explain what those sounds meant. I have stopped trying. I checked my watch again at some point, certain that hours had passed, and it read 1:47. 25 minutes. It felt like the better part of a night had already been spent lying rigid in a bag that suddenly felt too thin to be called shelter. Later, comparing notes in the truck, Marcus swore he woke at 1, Eric was certain it was closer to 2, and none of our three memories of that night have ever lined up since. Not the timing, not the order of sounds, not even how many voices we each counted. It was as if the night itself had refused to hold still long enough to be measured the way my father taught me. Measuring was supposed to work. Somewhere near the middle of it, I heard something at the fire ring. Not the breathing, not the feet in water. Something closer, something soft-moving, stone against stone in the exact spot where our cook kit sat, 10 feet from my tent wall. I did not look. I could not make myself unzip that fabric and put my face into that dark, and I have spent 2 years telling myself that was the sensible choice and not the coward's one. The patrol along the creek continued for 2 hours by every watch we compared, retreating and returning, until sometime near 4 the sounds thinned and pulled back downstream and did not come again. Marcus spoke first, once the gray had started to bleed into the trees. "Did you hear that?" Not a question, just a man needing to confirm he was not alone in what he'd survived. Eric answered with one word. Yes, I unzipped my tent into that pre-dawn cold and stepped toward the fire ring, and the first thing I saw was my father's old brass compass, the one I had packed for no reason I could name, sitting in the exact center of the dead fire where I had left it zipped inside my pack the night before. We went down to the creek once there was enough light to see, and the evidence was worse than the sound had prepared us for. Stones rolled from settled positions, banks pressed with barefoot prints, wide at the toe, flat through the arch, no heel strike at all, the kind of print that does not belong to any gait a person can consciously produce. The tracks crossed and recrossed each other in loops that looked less like walking and more like patrol, multiple individuals covering the same 40 yards over and over. And in one line of prints, the left foot dragged slightly on every step, a shallow furrow through the sand that I recognized before I let myself admit I recognized it, because it was the exact uneven weight my father carried after his hip surgery, the limp I used to hear coming down our hallway at night for the last 2 years of his life. I thought about the fire ring then, the one he told me he built with 3 other men decades before I was born, on this same bend of this same creek, in this same triangle of stacked stone. I had always assumed that was just a story, a piece of camp folklore fathers tell their sons to make a place feel owned. Standing over those prints, I understood it differently. Whatever had circled our camp that night had circled a camp on that ground before, maybe many times before, across however many Octobers men like my father had been foolish enough, or grieving enough, to come back. The compass was the part I never told Marcus or Eric the full truth about, not that morning, not since. It had not simply been moved. It was resting open, needle settled, pointing not north but directly at the bend in the creek, where the deepest cluster of prints began, as though something had picked it up, understood exactly what it was for, and used it to leave an answer rather than take one. I have never found a version of that fact I can live inside comfortably. I have simply learned to stop turning it over in my hands. We hiked out that morning without running, without panic, 4 miles of trail that had felt like an invitation on the way in and felt like a corridor on the way out, something else's corridor, briefly loaned to us. We still take our October trip. We choose sites close to the trailhead now, close to gravel and cell signal and the ordinary world that behaves the way the world is supposed to behave. We have never gone back to that clearing, and we have never fully agreed on what those guttural sounds between the breathing were trying to say, and I have decided I do not want that particular answer. What I have not stopped doing is counting. Every night I camp, I lie in the dark and count the sounds outside my tent, the way my father taught me, because a number is supposed to be the one thing fear cannot bend. But now I know the counting was never the safety he promised me. It was the thing that told them, the last time, exactly how many of us there were to watch, and exactly how patient they would need to be to see me come back. There is a particular stillness that settles over a hollow in the Appalachian Mountains when something that does not belong there has been watching for a long time, and I have learned to recognize that stillness the way a man learns to recognize the sound of his own name spoken from across a room he thought was empty. I have been teaching second grade in Mingo County, West Virginia for 11 years, in a school that serves families whose roots in these mountains go back 5 and 6 generations. And I have learned that this place is not poor because the people here lack ambition. It is poor because the terrain refuses to let go of anything, least of all the people who were born inside it. The ridges are steep, the hollows are deep, and the distance between one house and the next can feel like the distance between one planet and the next when the weather turns. I teach here because I grew up here and because I know that a child who falls asleep at his desk is not lazy. He is cold. He is sharing a bed with 2 siblings in a house where the heat runs on a schedule that depends on whether anyone can afford to fill the propane tank that week. That is the world I work in, and for 11 years I thought I understood every kind of trouble that world could produce. Caleb was one of my students. A small, quiet boy with brown hair and eyes that were too large for his face, the kind of eyes that take in everything and give back almost nothing until the child has decided what to do with what he has seen. He lived with his grandmother, Doris, in a narrow hollow about 4 miles from the school, up a road that turned to gravel and then to something that was barely a road at all, ending at a small frame house with vinyl siding and a metal roof and a porch that ran the width of the front. The house was neat. The yard was mowed. Behind the house, the forest came down to the yard on 3 sides, the trees climbing the ridge in a dense wall that in summer blocked the sky and that in October was just beginning to open as the leaves let go. Caleb's attendance was perfect. He came every morning, did his work, spoke when he was spoken to, and got on the bus every afternoon with the steady rhythm of a child whose life at home was holding together in the way that mattered. His mother was gone in the way that mothers sometimes are in these counties, a situation the community understood and did not discuss. His father had never been present at all. Doris raised him with the kind of competence that does not advertise itself, the competence of a woman who has been solving problems since before the problems learned how to name themselves. He stopped coming on a Tuesday in October. I marked it in my roll book and moved on because students miss days for reasons that range from a flat tire on a gravel road to a cousin's funeral in a county 2 hours away. Wednesday, no Caleb. Thursday, no Caleb. I called the landline at Doris's house that evening because cell service does not reach that hollow and there was no answer. I called twice more before bed. Nothing. On Friday, after the last bell rang, I drove out. The road climbed through the kind of terrain that defines this part of the state, past the point where the pavement ended and the gravel began, past the last mailbox and the last stretch of maintained road, into the narrowing crease in the mountain where Doris's house sat at the end of a track that was more memory than infrastructure. The maples were turning. The oaks were going brown. The air had that particular October smell of cold water and decomposing leaves and wood smoke from a stovepipe somewhere in the next hollow over. I pulled into the turnaround and cut the engine and sat for a moment before I got out. And I want to be honest about something. The stillness I felt when I stepped out of that car was not ordinary stillness. It was the stillness of a place that was being listened to. Doris was on the porch. She was sitting in her chair, not rocking, not reading, not doing anything at all, except watching the road, with the expression of a woman who has been watching the road for days, and who is no longer expecting what she sees. I walked to the porch and said hello and asked about Caleb, and I watched her face do something I had seen before in 11 years of working with families in this county, but never quite this way. She was deciding what to tell me, not whether to lie. Doris was not a liar. She was deciding how much of what she was living with could be translated into words that a schoolteacher would accept without concluding that she had finally lost her mind. She said Caleb was fine. He was inside. He did not want to come to school. I asked why. She looked at me for a long time, and her eyes moved from my face to the tree line behind the house and back, and then she told me it was because of the children in the woods. She said they had started coming about 2 weeks before. At first, she thought they were children from one of the other hollows. The way children in these mountains have always moved through the forest in the hours between school and dark, ranging over thousands of acres of woodland that no one owns and no one supervises. She heard them first. Sounds above the house after sunset, the crack of a branch, the displacement of leaves by something moving through them with a purpose that was not casual. She did not think much of it. Children play in the woods. The sounds were unremarkable. Then Caleb saw them from his bedroom window, which faced the ridge, and he came out of his room at night and told her there were children in the yard. And she went to his window and looked and saw shapes at the tree line, low to the ground, moving along the edge where the mowed grass met the trees. They were on all fours. They moved with the quick, fluid efficiency of animals, not children pretending to be animals, but something for which that posture was native. Something that covered ground on 4 limbs, because 4 limbs was how it had learned to travel. She turned on the porch light. The shapes stopped. In the light that reached the tree line, she could see them clearly. They were children, or they had the approximate size and proportion of children, but they were naked and filthy, and their hair was long and matted, and they were positioned with their hands and feet planted flat, their backs level, their heads raised and turned toward the house in a posture that was alert and watchful, and that showed no surprise at the light, no startle, no reaction that suggested the light was unexpected or unwelcome. They watched the house. Doris watched them. The moment held for half a minute, and then they turned and scuttled back into the trees with a speed that was not human, moving up the ridge on 4 limbs with the fluency of something that knew the terrain the way a fish knows water. They came back every night after that. She saw them from the windows, from the porch, always after dark, always at the edge of the forest, always on all fours. She counted 4, possibly 5, ranging in size from what she estimated was a 6-year-old to a teenager, and they moved in a loose group that was not random, a formation that suggested coordination without hierarchy, the way a pack moves when every member has internalized its role. They came closer each night. The first week, they stayed at the tree line. By the second week, they were in the yard, crossing the mowed grass on their hands and feet with a silence that Doris said was more disturbing than anything else about them, more disturbing than the posture or the speed or the nakedness. They made no sound, no vocalization, no breathing she could hear, no rustle of grass under their hands. They moved through the yard like projections of something that occupied space without fully entering it. Caleb had stopped sleeping. He had seen them from his window on multiple nights, and the sight had done something to him that reassurance could not undo. He would not go to his room after dark. He slept on the couch with every light in the house burning and the television on, and Doris in her chair beside him. He was not hysterical. He was not performing. The fear in him was the deep, settled fear of a child who has seen something real and understands that the adults around him cannot make it not real. I sat on that porch for an hour and asked every question I could formulate. She said the neighbors knew. People in the hollow had been seeing signs for months, hearing them in the woods, finding footprints in the morning, and the remains of small animals that had been caught and eaten raw. Nobody was calling the sheriff. Nobody was calling anyone. The hollow was handling it the way hollows in Mingo County handle things that do not fit inside the official world, which is privately with locked doors and porch lights, and with the understanding that some problems do not have solutions, only accommodations that buy time. I went home and sat in my kitchen and tried to apply 11 years of training to what she had told me. I am a mandatory reporter. If there are children living in the woods without shelter or supervision, I am legally obligated to involve Child Protective Services. But what would I report? That an elderly woman in a remote hollow believes she has seen feral children moving on all fours near her house at night. The report would be filed. A social worker would drive out. The social worker would find nothing, because whatever was living in those woods was not going to present itself to a county vehicle with a clipboard. I went back the following week. Caleb was still not in school. Doris was on the porch again, and she looked worse. The fatigue of sustained vigilance written into the set of her shoulders and the way her hands rested in her lap. She said they had been on the porch the night before. Not in the yard, not at the tree line, on the porch. She had heard the boards creak under a weight she could not see in the dark, the soft compression of old wood under bare feet, and she had sat in the living room with every light on, and the door locked, and listened to something walk the length of her porch and stop at the window and breathe against the glass. I filed a report that night. I described a concern for child welfare involving possible unsupervised minors in a remote area. The county sent someone within the week. They found nothing. No children, no footprints, no evidence of habitation in the woods above the hollow. The case was closed in a single phone call. Caleb came back to school in November. Doris brought him herself, driving the truck to the school rather than putting him on the bus, and she walked him to my classroom and stood in the doorway and said they had left. The children in the woods had moved on sometime in late October. The sounds had stopped. The nightly visits had ended. The hollow had returned to the quiet it had held before they arrived. She did not look relieved. She looked like a woman who understood that left was not the same as gone, and that the woods above her hollow were the same woods that connected to every other hollow in the county, and that whatever had been living in them was still living in them somewhere, moving through the mountains the way mountain things have always moved, following the ridges and the drainages and the hollows that form the hidden highway system of the Appalachian interior. Caleb never spoke about it. Not to me, not to the other children, not that I ever heard. He came back and did his work and sat at his desk with the same quiet watchfulness that had always defined him, the large eyes taking in the room and processing it internally before offering any response. But he did not sit near the windows anymore. He chose a desk in the middle of the room, away from the glass, away from the view of the tree line that was visible from the east-facing windows of the school. And when the other children ran to the windows during a storm or a fire drill, or to watch a hawk pass over the playground, Caleb stayed at his desk and did not look. He knew what was in the woods. He had seen it from his bedroom window on all fours, watching his house with the patient attention of something that had been watching houses for a long time, and that intended to continue watching them long after the people inside had stopped looking back. And I believe he understood, at 7 years old, with the clarity of a child who has seen something that adults have chosen not to see, that the windows work both ways, that if you can see the tree line from the classroom, the tree line can see you, that some things, once they know where you are, do not stop watching just because you have decided to stop looking. I still drive that road sometimes, on weekends when the weather is good, and I have no reason to be anywhere in particular. I do not slow down at the turnaround in front of Doris's house. I keep my eyes on the gravel and my hands on the wheel, and I tell myself I am just passing through, just confirming that the place is still there, that the porch light is still on, that the hollow is still the hollow I remember. The last time I drove past, in early December, the yard was mowed and the porch was swept, and the house looked exactly as it had always looked, neat and maintained by a woman who practices keeping as a form of self-respect. But the tree line behind the house was bare, the leaves all down, The branches opened to the sky in a way they had not been in October, and the sight lines through the woods were clear enough to see a long way up the ridge. I did not slow down. I did not stop. But I watched the tree line the entire time I was in view of it, and the tree line watched me back, and somewhere in those woods, on a ridge that connects to every other ridge in the county, something that moves on 4 limbs and makes no sound at all was doing the same thing I was doing. It was waiting to see if I would look away first. Story 4. The nest chamber. For 15 years I crawled into the earth to stand where no human had ever stood. Last March, in a limestone cave under the Greenbrier Valley, I found a room where a family already slept, and I have not slept right since. We were 4 that morning. Me, Travis, Sarah, and Doug, people who trusted rock more than we trusted the world above it. The entrance was a hillside slit 4 feet high, sealed with a steel gate the Conservancy kept locked to protect the bats. I had the key in my pocket, and I remember thinking how strange it was that a lock could belong to us and to the dark at the same time. We were pushing a crawlway the old survey had marked, "Continues, unexplored." A belly page 80 inches high, 2,000 feet from daylight. I went first because I always go first. The rock pressed my chest into the sand, and my headlamp lit nothing but the next 12 inches of my own future. Then I felt it. Air. Moving air, cool against the sweat on my face, and I called back that it was a good sign, that moving air means the passage breathes, means it opens into something larger. The crawl widened. Hands and knees, then a crouch. Then I was standing in a chamber 30 feet across, its ceiling domed like the inside of a skull. My light swept the walls, and none of us spoke for a long time. 7 shallow depressions had been scooped into the deep sand around the perimeter, evenly spaced, each one lined, not with cave debris, with leaves and moss, with matted animal fur, and with strips of cloth torn from human clothing. I knelt at the nearest one. The lining held a strip of plaid flannel, red and black, frayed at the torn edge. There was denim and a shiny ribbon of nylon jacket, all pressed flat and smoothed by weight. The sand beneath each hollow was packed into the shape of a sleeping body, the curve of a spine, the tuck of drawn-up knees. Some hollows were long. Some were very small. Then the smell reached me. Not the cold mineral breath of stone. This was warm, musky, organic. The smell of bodies that lived close together and never washed. Under it ran something I knew instantly and did not want to name. Human sweat, the ordinary salt and skin smell of my own species, concentrated and old. Travis crouched over the sand and said one word: footprints. Barefoot, 5-toed, but the toes spread wide, splayed like something that had never worn a shoe. The tread was flat, no heel strike, the print of a thing that walks the way animals walk, quietly so it can hear what walks toward it. Large prints. Medium. Small. The passage directly across from us, the one leading deeper, was polished smooth by the daily passage of feet. Sarah was already backing toward the crawlway. Her body had decided something her mouth had not caught up to yet, and I felt it too, not fear of a place, but the specific animal shame of standing in a den while the den's owners are out. I looked at the small hollows, and the moving air touched the back of my neck, and I understood we had to leave before the breathing had a face. We left. 4 bodies back through 2,000 feet of stone, and nobody spoke, because a tight crawl takes everything you have. It was in the truck, halfway down the mountain, that the argument started. Travis wanted to call the Conservancy. Doug wanted the police. Sarah said we should tell no one, and she said it with a flat certainty that had hardened somewhere in the dark. She said whatever lived there survived because no one knew, and that reporting it would only feed those people into a system with no category for them. We did not report it. That silence is the first thing I got wrong, because I could not stop looking. At home, I pulled every regional caving log I could find, and then I started reading the other lists, the ones the sheriff's departments keep. Hikers who stepped off the Greenbrier trails and were never recovered. A father and his 2 children, 2009, tents left standing, food untouched. A woman in 2016, car locked, keys on the seat. The valley had been quietly losing people into itself for decades, and every one of them had walked in wearing clothes. The plaid flannel stayed in my mind, red and black. I told myself it meant nothing. Half the men in that county owned a shirt like it. Then Travis called. He had gone back through his photos from the chamber, zooming in, and he wanted me to look at the denim strip. There was stitching on it, a back pocket seam, and above it, faint, a name written in laundry marker the way you label a child's clothes for camp. He could not read all of it. He could read the first letter. It was an SI, did not tell Sarah. I want that on the record too. The dream started that week. Not nightmares exactly, just the chamber, exactly as it was, except I was lying in one of the hollows and it fit me. The moss under my cheek, the fur, the torn cloth warm from my own heat, and in the dream the air moved in and out, and I finally understood that it was not ventilation, it was respiration. The whole cave was breathing, slow and patient, and I was inside its lung. I would wake at 3 in the morning certain I had heard something under the house. We live on limestone here. Everyone in this valley does. A few hundred feet down, the same rock that holds that chamber runs unbroken beneath my floor, beneath my daughter's floor, connected by miles of passage I will never see. I started sleeping with the closet light on, which is a thing I have not done since I was 6. Then Doug stopped answering. He was the one who had wanted to follow the deeper passage, and now his phone went to voicemail for 11 days. When he finally called back, his voice was wrong, thin, careful. He said he had gone to the cave alone. He said the nests had been rearranged, and he said there was a new one now, freshly scooped, sized for a grown man, lined with a strip of gray fabric he recognized, because it matched the jacket he had worn on the day we found the place. He hung up before I could answer. I have not heard from him since. Sarah, when I finally called her, did not sound frightened. She sounded relieved. She said she had known from the first minute that we were not the discoverers. She said, very quietly, that you do not find a home like that. A home like that decides to let you in. I understand the fabric now. It was never torn from strangers dragged below. It was set out as an invitation, the way you lay down a bowl and a soft place before something moves in. The people who vanished from those trails did not become prey. They became residents. The plaid flannel, the denim with the S, the small hollows sized for small bodies. They were not victims wrapped in their own ruined clothes. They were the ones who sleep there now, wearing what remains of the people they used to be, teaching children who have never seen the sun how to walk flat and quiet on splayed feet. I went back to the sheriff's list one last time, looking for the father and his 2 children from 2009. The report named the daughter. Her initial was S. I closed the laptop and did not open it again. Here is the part I've told no one until now. 3 nights ago, I found my back door unlocked, though I lock it the way other men pray. Nothing was taken from the kitchen, nothing from the safe. But the laundry basket in the hall had been gone through, and 2 things were missing. An old flannel shirt of mine, red and black, and a small pink sweatshirt that belongs to my daughter. Torn, I think. There were threads on the floor leading to the basement door, and the basement, in this valley, is only the top of the rock. The air in my house moves now. I feel it at night against the back of my neck, cool and slow, in and out, and I lie there and I can no longer tell whether it is the furnace or whether the whole hillside beneath me has begun to breathe. I keep the closet light on. It does not help. Light was never the thing they were afraid of. For 15 years, I crawled into the earth to be somewhere no one had ever been, and I told myself the dark did not care about me, that it was massive and indifferent, and simply was. I was wrong about the indifference. Somewhere 2,000 feet down there is a fresh hollow scooped into the sand, man-sized, and beside it a smaller one, and both of them are lined and waiting, warm already, as if they know the exact shape of who is coming. I will never go back to that chamber. But the chamber, patient as stone, is finally coming for me, and when it takes my daughter's small sweatshirt and lays it in the small hollow and smooths the sand into the curve of a sleeping child, I already know what I will do. I will not call the conservancy. I will not call the police. I will follow the moving air down into the breathing dark, because a home like that does not let you in. It decides. And it has decided that we were always residents. It is only waiting, quietly, darkly, with the long patience of rock, for the rest of us to come home. The snow does not lie, but what it showed me that February morning made me wish I had gone blind before I ever learned to read a track. I have spent 14 years as a conservation officer in the Daniel Boone National Forest, walking 40,000 acres of rugged Kentucky terrain until I know every ridge and hollow by the feel of the mud beneath my boots. I investigate poaching, check licenses, and monitor wildlife, trusting that the world operates on a set of rules I can understand and enforce. That trust evaporated when I knelt beside a set of footprints leading away from a butchered deer carcass 6 miles from the nearest road. The prints were human in basic shape, yet they violated every law of biomechanics I had ever studied or experienced in my career. The scene itself was standard enough for this time of year, a grim reminder of the greed that drives men to kill out of season. A deer lay half butchered in the creek bottom, its back straps and hindquarters removed with the clean, efficient cuts of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. 4 inches of fresh snow blanketed the area, preserving every detail with photographic clarity, from the scattered feathers of a scavenging vulture to the delicate paw prints of a coyote. But amidst these expected signs of forest life, a single trail of barefoot prints cut through the white silence, heading upstream with a purpose that felt aggressively wrong. I stared at them for a long time, trying to force my brain to categorize them as something familiar, but the details refused to align with reality. The toes were splayed so wide that distinct gaps separated each digit, creating an arc far broader than any foot confined by shoes since childhood. There was no heel strike, no deep indentation where weight lands first before rolling forward. Instead, the entire sole pressed into the snow with uniform depth, flat and heavy like an animal distributing its weight evenly across the ground. The stride length measured 42 inches, a distance too long for a walk but too short for a run, suggesting a gait that existed in some uncanny valley between human locomotion and something else entirely. I stood up, my breath hitching in the cold air, realizing that whatever made these tracks was moving with a confidence that defied the freezing temperature of the creek water it was about to cross. I followed the trail as it led straight into the rushing water, ignoring the shallow crossings where any sensible hiker would ford the stream. The prints entered the 34-degree current and emerged on the other bank without a single hesitation mark, as if the biting cold were nothing more than a gentle breeze against warm skin. My own fingers were already numb inside my gloves, yet the creature that left these marks seemed to possess a physiology that simply did not register pain or discomfort from the elements. The track then approached a 30-foot face of angled sandstone, a vertical challenge that would require me to detour 100 yards to find a climbable route. Without breaking stride, the prints went straight up the rock, the toes gripping the hard stone with a prehensile strength that left visible scuff marks on the surface. It was here that I noticed the first of 3 small details that would later haunt my sleep, though they seemed insignificant at the time. Near the base of the rock face, a cluster of winterberries hung untouched, their bright red skins unbroken despite being at eye level for anything walking past. Further up the trail, the snow around a fallen log showed no sign of disturbance, as if the entity had stepped over the 6-foot obstacle without ever touching the wood or the ground beneath it. And finally, the air around the tracks carried a faint, metallic scent, not quite blood and not quite ozone, clinging to the back of my throat with every breath I took. I filed these observations away in the back of my mind, focusing instead on the sheer impossibility of the tracks continuing upward with such relentless momentum. The trail led past a hunting cabin I knew well, a leased property where a party from Lexington often stayed during the season. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a truck sat parked in front, indicating that 3 men were inside, safe and warm behind thick wooden walls. The tracks passed merely 20 yards from the rear window, close enough that anyone looking out would have seen a naked figure strides through the snow with that terrible, flat-footed gait. I knocked on the door, needing to speak to another human voice to anchor myself back in the world of logic and reason. The men who answered looked exhausted, their faces pale and drawn in a way that suggested they had not slept a wink all night. They confirmed the poaching report, but quickly shifted the conversation to their 2 hounds, experienced bear dogs that had refused to leave the porch after dark. The animals had whimpered and trembled in the corner furthest from the back wall, paralyzed by a fear so absolute it silenced their usual barking instincts. When I mentioned the tracks, the men fell silent, exchanging glances that spoke of a shared terror they could not articulate. I left them there, turning back to the woods to follow the line of prints to its inevitable end, unaware that I was walking toward a truth that would unravel my understanding of solitude forever. The tracks climbed steadily to the ridge, maintaining that same impossible 42-inch stride regardless of the steepening grade or the roughness of the terrain. My lungs burned with the effort of keeping pace, my legs aching as I scrambled over ice-slicked rocks, while the prints ahead showed no variation in depth or rhythm. It was as if the entity making them was not fighting gravity but negotiating with it, moving through the forest with an efficiency that made my own exertion feel clumsy and wasteful. The metallic scent grew stronger here, mixing with the smell of wet pine and frozen earth until it felt like I was breathing in the taste of old copper. Every step I took felt louder, an intrusion into a silence that had been carefully curated by something that did not want to be found, but did not care if it was seen. I began to question my own senses, wondering if the isolation of the backcountry had finally cracked my professional composure. Had I missed a training module on unusual gaits? Was this some kind of prank by locals who had crafted fake feet to mess with the officers? But the physics of the snow did not lie. The displacement was real, the weight significant, and the toe impressions too complex to be forged with a simple tool. The memory of the dog's terror replayed in my mind, overriding my logical deductions with a primal warning that my brain tried desperately to suppress. These animals had tracked bears and cougars without flinching, yet they had shut down completely at the presence of whatever walked these tracks. That specific kind of canine shutdown only happens when an animal encounters a predator that exists outside its evolutionary memory, a threat so alien that flight or fight responses become irrelevant. The trail descended into a shallow depression where a sandstone overhang created a natural shelter, roughly 15 feet wide and 6 feet deep. Here, the snow ended abruptly at the drip line of the rock, and the ground beneath was frozen hard, offering no purchase for further impressions. The tracks led straight to the edge of the shelter, and then simply ceased, vanishing as if the walker had lifted into the air or dissolved into the stone itself. I circled the area for an hour, scanning every inch of the frozen ground and the rocky perimeter for any sign of departure. There were no exit tracks, no scuff marks indicating a jump, and no disturbance in the frost that would suggest someone had hidden behind the rocks. The entity had arrived, entered the shelter, and then ceased to exist in the physical realm that I could perceive. Inside the shelter, the ground was unnaturally smooth, swept clean of leaves and debris in a way that suggested habitual use over a long period. Soot stains blackened the back wall, evidence of fires lit long ago, yet there was no ash, no charcoal, and no smell of recent smoke to indicate current occupation. It felt less like a campsite and more like a waiting room, a place where something paused before continuing a journey that had no destination I could comprehend. The silence here was heavy, pressing against my eardrums with a physical weight that made it difficult to think or breathe normally. I reached out to touch the soot-stained wall, and for a fleeting second, the texture felt warm, pulsing slightly beneath my gloved fingertips before returning to the cold hardness of stone. That moment of warmth shattered my remaining denial, flooding my system with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the February air. I realized then that the untouched berries, the undisturbed snow over the log, and the metallic scent were not random anomalies, but signs of a biology that operated on different principles than my own. The berries were untouched because they were not food. The log was bypassed because it was not an obstacle. The scent was not blood, but perhaps a pheromone or a chemical marker of territory. My mind raced to categorize this, to file it under unknown species or hoax, but the emotional weight of the experience crushed those labels instantly. This was not an animal, and it was not a man. It was something that had adapted to these mountains in a way that rendered human survival strategies obsolete. I took photographs and measurements with trembling hands, knowing that none of this would ever make it into an official report. How could I explain a gait that defied anatomy to a supervisor who cared only about poaching statistics and budget allocations? To write this down would be to invite ridicule or, worse, an investigation that might draw attention to things better left alone. The dog's fear suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. They had sensed a presence that did not belong in the food chain, a predator that viewed humans not as threats but as incidental furniture in its domain. As I turned to leave the shelter, I felt a sudden, sharp spike of vertigo, as if the ground beneath me had tilted slightly off its axis. The trees seemed to lean inward, closing the distance between them, and the light filtering through the branches took on a gray, sickly hue that drained the color from the world. I forced myself to walk away, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to reclaim the rhythm of a normal patrol. But with every step, I became hyper-aware of my own heels striking the ground, the clumsy roll of my feet, the restrictive pinch of my boots. I felt loud, fragile, and painfully exposed, like a child wandering into a den of wolves while wearing a bell around my neck. The realization settled in my gut that I was not the apex predator in this forest, nor was I even a peer to the creatures that lived here. I was an intruder in a place that had been occupied long before my department drew its boundaries, by something that walked barefoot in the snow and laughed at the cold. The path back to the road felt longer than it should have, the landmarks shifting subtly in my peripheral vision, teasing me with the possibility that I might never truly leave this drainage. I filed my report on the poaching incident 3 days later, documenting the deer carcass and the clean cuts with professional detachment. I omitted the footprints, the flat gate, the climbing toes, and the shelter that swallowed a traveler without leaving a trace. To include them would be to admit that the map I had used for 14 years was incomplete, that the borders of my understanding were porous and leaking things I could not name. I kept the photographs in my personal notebook locked away, revisiting them only in the quiet hours of the night when the house was still and the wind rattled the windows. Each time I looked at the images, the details seemed to sharpen, the gaps between the toes appearing wider, the stride length stretching further beyond the realm of possibility. I returned to that drainage many times in the months that followed, patrolling with a heightened sense of awareness that bordered on paranoia. The creek flowed as it always had, the cabin stood empty in the off-season, and the rock overhang remained dry and silent under the sun. Never once did I find those prints again, nor any sign that the entity had resumed its journey or settled permanently in the shelter. Yet the absence of evidence did not bring comfort. Instead, it cultivated a lingering dread that the thing was simply better at hiding now that it knew I was looking. The forest felt different, charged with a latent energy that made the hair on my arms stand up whenever I ventured too deep into the hollows. In the break rooms and at county meetings, I began to speak quietly with other officers, testing the waters with vague questions about unusual sightings or unexplained tracks. At first, they dismissed my inquiries as fatigue or the result of too much time alone in the woods, but then slowly the tone of the conversation shifted, eyes darting away, voices dropping to whispers that barely carried across the table. Some nodded solemnly, admitting to finding similar prints in their own districts, tracks that showed wide splayed toes and flat-footed strides in the mud or snow. Others described encounters with wildlife that behaved strangely, dogs that refused to hunt certain ridges, and a pervasive feeling of being watched by something that moved without sound. It became clear that I was not the first to see this, nor would I be the last, and that a silent consensus existed among us to keep these stories out of the official record. The 3 details I had noted that day, the untouched berries, the undisturbed snow, and the metallic scent, now reframed themselves in my mind with terrifying clarity. The berries were not ignored. They were irrelevant to a diet that did not rely on flora. The snow was not stepped over. The entity likely possessed a density or temperature regulation that prevented it from sinking or melting the surface. And the scent was not a byproduct of injury but a biological signature, a marker of a species that had evolved in isolation deep within the Appalachian chain. We were not sharing this land. We were merely tolerating guests who allowed us to stay as long as we did not pry too deeply into their business. The horror was not in the monster itself, but in the realization of how little we actually knew about the world we claimed to manage. My vulnerability, once rooted in the fear of the unknown, has calcified into a grim acceptance of our insignificance. I no longer walk the forest with the authority of an enforcer, but with the caution of a visitor in a house that does not belong to him. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of shadow, sends a jolt of adrenaline through my system, reminding me that the rules of nature I rely on are fragile constructs. The dog's fear was the only honest reaction, the only true assessment of the situation, while my human intellect tried desperately to rationalize the irrational. I am haunted not by what I saw, but by what I failed to see. The moment it stopped watching me and slipped back into the fabric of the mountain, invisible and indifferent. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the wind howling through the trees and imagine it sounds like the rhythmic slap of bare feet on frozen ground. I wonder if it is still walking, still covering those 42 inches with every effortless stride, moving toward a destination that has no name on any map. The ambiguity of its disappearance is the cruelest part of the curse, leaving me to wonder if it ever left the shelter at all, or if it is waiting for the next snowfall to begin its journey anew. I know now that the Daniel Boone National Forest holds secrets that predate our laws and will outlast our presence, guarded by things that walk barefoot in the freezing cold. We are not alone in these mountains, and the knowledge of that companionship is a burden that grows heavier with every passing season. The snow will fall again, blanketing the ridges and hollows in a pristine white sheet that promises to reveal all truths. But I know better than to trust its honesty, for some tracks are meant to be seen only by those who are ready to lose their peace of mind forever. Whatever walks with us moves without sound, without heat, and without any concern for whether we acknowledge its presence. It is efficient, purposeful, and utterly wrong, a living contradiction that thrives in the spaces between our understanding. And as I lace up my boots each morning, preparing to face the woods once more, I cannot shake the feeling that I am the one being tracked, my own clumsy heels marking a path for something that has been waiting a very long time to catch up. I have been a nursing home director for 23 years, and 6 years ago I stopped calling the police when my residents disappeared. That was not surrender. It was the first honest decision I ever made in this job, because by then I knew that whatever was taking them did not come from a direction anyone with a badge was willing to look. I run Ridge Haven, 72 beds on a ridge in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia. The north wing windows face a tree line that begins 40 feet from the glass, and that tree line is the whole story. Most of our people are what the industry politely calls legacy residents. They came to us decades ago with no money and no family, and they will leave in a van with a county sticker on the door. I grew up 2 counties over from here, so I understood the poverty and the pride, and the way people in these hollows die quietly on purpose. My mother raised me on this same ridge with one rule she repeated every evening of my childhood. "Get in before dark," she said. "The mountain gets hungry after supper." Harold was the first. 17 years with us, moderate dementia, no living relatives, a man who folded his own laundry because he did not trust anybody else to do it right. He left the building sometime after 2 in the morning, and a jogger found him 2 miles out the next day, dead of exposure. That much was ordinary, and I could have carried that. What I could not carry was the clothing. Harold went to bed in blue pajamas, and his pajamas were still on his bed, folded into a square with the sleeves tucked under. The body was dressed in a wool coat and work pants I had never seen in 17 years of doing his intake inventory myself, and his shoes were sitting at the tree line, 100 yards from where he was found, set side by side with the laces tucked down inside them. A man does not tidy up before he freezes to death. The coroner wrote exposure, told me confused people do strange things, and asked if I wanted a copy for my files. 2 weeks after that, I started a program I was genuinely proud of. I made a laminated card for the nurses' station listing every resident who had not received a single visitor in 12 months, and I marked those names in yellow highlighter so the staff would sit with them longer, call them by name, hold their hands during dressing changes. 11 names went yellow that first month. I wrote them in my own handwriting, in order, and I hung the card at eye level where anyone walking past the desk could read it. There is one more thing from that winter, and I did not think it mattered. The morning after Harold, the north hallway smelled like wet ash and cold pennies. Housekeeping blamed the boiler. Maintenance pointed out that the boiler sits on the south end of the building, under concrete, and has never once smelled like anything but oil. 6 months later, Dorothy went. 19 years with us, no family, and not a wanderer. A woman who would not walk to the dining room without her cane and an escort. The aides charted that Dorothy spent the evening telling anyone who passed that somebody outside was calling her name and that they were doing it wrong, drawing the second syllable out too long. At 3:40 in the morning, she opened a locked exterior door that requires a key card, and she was never found. When I pulled the door log the next day, it did not record an exit. It recorded an entry, and it recorded it under the badge number of a nurse who had quit and moved to Ohio 2 years earlier. Chester disappeared 3 months after Dorothy. 13 years with us, no family, no history of leaving his chair, let alone his room. The night aide charted that he sat at his window from midnight until 2, upright, hands folded in his lap, watching the trees like a man waiting on a ride he had already paid for. At the 6 o'clock rounds, his bed was cold, and it was made. Nobody at Ridgehaven has ever seen a man with dementia make a bed with hospital corners. The state police brought a tracking dog. It followed Chester's scent 40 feet across frozen grass and stopped dead at the first row of trees. The handler stood there a long moment and told me the dog had quit tracking and started listening. Then he asked, very politely, whether we could finish up before the light went. I pulled 5 years of incident reports that week. Beyond the 3 disappearances, there had been 7 other night attempts, all of them residents with no visitors, all of them suddenly desperate to get outside between 2 and 4 in the morning. 3 described a voice they recognized. One woman in room 22 told the aide her husband was outside, and she was irritated with him for being late. Her husband died in 1998. Ava has worked our night shift for 11 years, and she does not exaggerate, which is why what she said in that staff meeting emptied the room of air. She told me she had seen people standing in the woods on her breaks, not moving like people, moving, she said, the way somebody walks when they are copying walking from memory. They stood and watched particular windows for hours. When I asked which windows, she named 4 rooms, and every one of them belonged to a resident who had later tried to leave, so I put cameras on the exterior walls. 19 nights later, I watched a figure cross the grass at 2:51 a.m., stop at the window of room 15, and press its face flat against the glass. It stayed there 3 minutes. The glass never fogged. Then the woman inside sat up in bed, smiled at it, and reached for her cardigan, and the only reason she is alive today is that Ava walked past her door at exactly the wrong moment for whatever was standing outside. The next clip is the one I have never shown anyone. At 3:12 that same night, something stood at my office window, facing in. Not looking at the desk, not looking at the safe. It was facing the wall where I had hung the laminated card. It stood there for the length of time it takes a slow reader to get through 11 names, and then it walked back to the trees. The sheriff's office watched 40 minutes of footage and told me it was teenagers. A deputy explained to me, kindly, that these people wander, ma'am, that is what they do, and that grief makes administrators see patterns. 2 days later, I found an entry in the night log in my own handwriting from a shift I did not work. It read, 14 asked if I had come to take her. Told her not tonight. My badge opened the north door at 2:41 that morning. I was 12 miles down the mountain, asleep, with my phone on the nightstand. I stopped sleeping and started spending money. Key card locks, motion sensors on every perimeter window, 2 extra aides on nights, curtains in the north wing that stay closed from dusk to 7. For 2 months there was nothing. No voices, no figures, no smell in the hallway. Then on a Thursday in March, Sarah got out. She was 84. No family since her daughter died in 2011, and she had somehow disabled the alarm contact on a door she could not have reached without a step stool. Ava found her 400 yards out in the field, walking hand in hand with something tall in dark clothing. When Ava screamed, it stopped and turned and considered her. It did not run. It stepped back into the trees, the way a man steps back from a counter when he decides against buying something. Sarah lived. Sarah talked, and I wrote every word down. She said her daughter had been calling from outside her window, and that the voice fit wrong, like a coat borrowed from somebody with different shoulders. She said that once they crossed into the trees, the thing stopped using her daughter's voice and started using something that was not language at all. And then Sarah looked at me, perfectly lucid for the first time in a year, and said the lady with the yellow pen had already given permission. Harold, Dorothy, Chester, Sarah. Those were the first 4 names on my laminated card in the order I wrote them. Ava took me into the woods the following Sunday, up an old logging cut, 40 minutes past the ridge line. In a flat clearing where the ground stays soft, there are shoes. Pairs of them set side by side with the laces tucked down inside, arranged in rows by size, running back into the brush farther than my flashlight would reach. Some pairs were newer than Harold's. Some had rotted down to the eyelets and the rubber, and rubber takes 40 years. Near the middle of the 3rd row, there is a size 6 women's walking shoe, white, with a blue orthopedic insert worn through at the right heel from a hip that never healed straight. My mother wore that insert for 9 years. She died in a facility 3 counties from here 11 years ago after wandering out a fire door in November and freezing in a stand of pine. They found her barefoot, and I accepted that, and I was relieved it had been fast, and I had not driven out to see her in 7 months. Somewhere in that building there was a list, and my mother's name was the brightest thing on it. I called 9 other directors in the region over the next year. 6 of them went quiet on the phone in the same particular way. Remote facilities, low visitor counts, residents nobody claims, disappearances filed as wandering. 2 of them keep lists exactly like mine for exactly the same decent reason, and both of them post those lists where anyone standing at the window can read them. The state told me I was under professional stress. The federal complaint line told me to submit documentation, and then never answered it. One official warned me, on the record, that unfounded accusations could damage my facility's reputation. So I stopped. I locked the doors, drew the curtains, took the card down off the wall, and the woods went silent, and it has stayed silent for 4 years. It never once felt like winning. It felt like a contract being honored by both parties. I still cannot explain the smell. Wet ash and cold pennies in the north hallway on nights when nothing happens and nobody wakes. It is in my own house now too, 12 miles down the mountain, in the hallway outside my bedroom 3 or 4 times a year. I am 61, no children, no husband, my sister buried in 2019. Some evening, not far from now, I will be the resident in a room with a window, and somebody younger and kinder than me will pick up a yellow pen and write my name down because nobody visits. I have already asked to be placed on the south side of the building. I do not think that will matter, because for the last 2 weeks a voice has been standing outside my kitchen window after dark, using my mother's mouth, telling me to get in before dark, and it is finally getting the words right. I am writing this down because the police report is clean. The university thinks I am simply resting on medical leave, and the graduate student, whose name I traded for survival, has finally stopped screaming in my nightmares. 19 years I spent at that Western Pennsylvania university teaching anthropology, lecturing on isolated populations that existed deliberately beyond the maps of modern civilization. I thought my academic specialization made me an authority on human margins, but it only made me arrogant enough to think I could look into the dark without the dark looking back. For a decade, I traded semester breaks for solo expeditions into the rugged hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, chasing whispers of feral communities that official records insisted did not exist. My colleagues watched my skin turn leathery, my clothes smell permanently of wood smoke, and my lectures become erratic, but they attributed it to the eccentricities of a dedicated scholar. They did not know about the damp soil that began staining the pages of my reference books, a heavy, mineral scent that clung to the binding long after I had returned to my climate-controlled office. They certainly did not notice the silver fountain pen I kept on my desk, which would occasionally vanish for days only to reappear chewed down to the metal, its nib warped by teeth that were never human. The isolation of the mountains had started to bleed into my everyday life, manifesting as a steady, rhythmic pacing that echoed just outside my office door during holiday lockouts when the building was entirely empty. I convinced myself it was just building maintenance or my own frayed nerves playing tricks on a mind overworked by the pursuit of an impossible truth. Then came the night on my fourth expedition when I stopped leaving provisions in hollow logs and started leaving notes written in clear, deliberate English. I told them I was an anthropologist, that I wanted to document their survival, and that I posed no threat to their absolute separation from the world. Their response did not come in words or academic papers left on a windshield, but in the subtle rearrangement of my private apartment while I was away teaching morning seminars. Every book on my shelf had been turned 1 degree to the left, every framed photograph faced the wall, and a clump of coarse gray hair lay precisely in the center of my bed. It was a clear, unambiguous message delivered without a single broken lock or forced window. They could touch my life whenever they chose, and my continued survival depended entirely on my willingness to serve as their archivist and their keeper. I abandoned all pretense of normal scholarship after that night, spending my weekends scouring ridgelines for footprints that vanished where the slate turned sharp and barren. The forest no longer felt like an object of study, but like a vast, breathing organism that was actively observing my movements with cold, predatory patience. Whenever I stood at the edge of the tree line, I could feel the microscopic weight of countless eyes pressing against the back of my neck. I was no longer an academic researcher seeking knowledge, but a tethered animal waiting for instructions from a master I could neither see nor comprehend. The University Senate began requesting formal status reports on my long-delayed monograph, but my desk drawers contained nothing except frantic notes scrawled in the margins of old topographical maps. I was eating less, sleeping in my academic chair rather than going home to my silent apartment, and jumping at the hollow sound of distant footsteps in the hallway. The boundary between my civilized academic existence and the feral silence of the mountains had dissolved entirely. I was already trapped inside their territory long before I ever handed them a human life to seal the bargain. My academic career disintegrated as my obsession tightened its grip on my sanity, reducing my life to a frantic cycle of grading papers by day and decoding forest silence by night. The university administration eventually intervened, forcing me onto a medical leave of absence under the pretense of exhaustion and mental breakdown. I accepted the terms because it gave me unrestricted freedom to spend weeks deep within the ridge lines, mapping paths that did not appear on topographical surveys. That was when Charlotte approached me in the department hallway, her eyes bright with the ambitious hunger of a first-year graduate student, desperate for a thesis topic that would make her career. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a sharp, surgical C minor that triggered an involuntary shiver down my spine. For one terrifying second, I thought I was back under the hemlocks with my boots sinking into the black mud. The illusion vanished as quickly as it arrived, leaving only the smell of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. I saw the exact reflection of my own past arrogance in her face, and instead of warning her away from the hollows, I cultivated her trust. I told her I had located a lost pocket of pre-industrial culture deep in the Pennsylvania highlands, a settlement that would rewrite every anthropology textbook in the country if documented correctly. Charlotte was eager, idealistic, and entirely unequipped for the silent, calculated intelligence that governed the hemlock ridges. I drove her to the trailhead under the guise of an initial reconnaissance trek, walking her deep into the fern-choked valleys where the canopy blocked out the midday sun. We made camp near a dry creek bed where the air grew noticeably colder and the usual forest birds fell entirely silent. When the darkness dropped like a heavy wool blanket, I slipped away from her tent while she slept, leaving her provisions untouched and her compass deliberately shattered on a flat stone. I did not run back to my truck out of panic or guilt, but with the steady, measured pace of a man paying a debt that had been overdue for years. They wanted fresh blood to weave into their kinless generation, and I had finally brought them an offering substantial enough to secure my permanent exemption. When I drove back into Pittsburgh the following morning, I played the part of the frantic mentor with practiced precision, calling campus security and local authorities before the sun had cleared the brick facades. I told the police that Charlotte had wandered off during a moment of disorientation, that the mountain mists had swallowed her while I was checking the grid coordinates. The university launched a thorough search, and the grieving family came to my office, thanking me for trying to keep her safe while I held back tears that were entirely performative. 3 months later, the envelope arrived in my department mailbox, with no return address and no postal stamp. The silence of my office felt heavy that afternoon as I slid open the heavy paper with a bone-handled letter opener. I had expected a note of condemnation, perhaps a warning from local authorities, or an anonymous threat demanding silence. Instead, I pulled out a single developed photograph that showed a world I had spent a decade trying to map with academic precision. The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp soil and ancient pine resin. Inside the thick manila envelope was a single Polaroid photograph taken under the dim, filtered light of a forest canopy I knew down to every rotting stump. Charlotte stood among a dozen figures draped in pelts and woven bark, her posture upright, her expression completely smooth and unbothered by the horror of her abduction. She wore clothes spun from coarse plant fibers, and her hand rested easily on the shoulder of a towering, faceless man whose features were obscured by shadow. Scrawled across the bottom of the photograph in uneven, block lettering were the words, "She contributes. You contributed. This is acceptable." The soil scent on my office books did not come from my own boots tracking in the outdoors. It was a calculated deposition meant to map every shelf I owned before I even noticed the invasion. The realization settled over me like a freezing mist that refused to burn off with the morning sun. The damp earth smell that had haunted my bookshelves for years wasn't carried in from the field, but marked every place they had been standing while I slept. The chewed-up fountain pen wasn't a stress habit of mine at all, but a warning left by teeth that needed to test the strength of my implements before they took mine. Even the heavy footsteps outside my office door during university holidays had never belonged to campus security, but to scouts checking to see if I was ready for my next assignment. I understood then that my apartment, my office, and my mind had never been my own. I was simply an outpost they maintained within the gates of civilization. I am 51 years old now, living quietly on a university disability pension, while my colleagues whisper about my premature aging and broken spirit. They think I am a tragic figure destroyed by grief over the lost graduate student whose disappearance remains an unsolved cold case in county files. Sometimes, sitting alone in my silent apartment, I wonder if the feral community is real, or if I simply engineered a catastrophic psychological break to justify my own monstrous cowardice. But the distinction is utterly meaningless when the outcome remains identical, because the blood is real, the Polaroid sits safely in my desk drawer, and my complicity is absolute. 19 years I spent trying to map the margins of the world, until I realized the world was mapping me, and now I hold the pencil for the next one. Next week, another ambitious graduate student is coming to my office asking about my Appalachian research, eager for a breakthrough that will change her life. I will smile, pour her a cup of black coffee, and tell her about the untouched hollows where the trees grow tall enough to hide the sky. I did not go missing into the mountains because I chose to stay right here, acting as the bridge between two worlds that can never be reconciled. There are 42 hours of unreleased raw footage sitting on an encrypted solid-state drive beneath my floorboards, and keeping it unposted is the only reason Daniels and I are still breathing. For 8 years, 200,000 subscribers trusted me to document remote North American wilderness without the dramatized jump scares or scripted survival tricks of mainstream outdoor television. I built my entire career on hyper-authentic capture, genuinely believing that if you record reality clearly enough, it cannot hurt you. That belief was an arrogant illusion, and it stripped away the moment we stepped onto an unmaintained bypass section of the Appalachian Trail along the Tennessee-Kentucky border. Daniels was managing our primary multi-track audio rig while I operated the cinema camera, fully committed to logging 14 days of pure, unvarnished atmospheric wilderness. My emotional firewall has always been my obsessively systematic technical workflow, As long as I am monitoring audio peaks and verifying mirror backups, nothing real can invade my world. That afternoon, my mobile phone was riding in my front chest pocket, continuously recording a redundant low bitrate ambient track just as an unscripted safety measure. We spotted the guide standing completely motionless beside a deadfall oak 3 miles past the last official Forest Service marker. He wore faded canvas hiking gear, carried a whittled hickory walking stick notched with deep crosshatches along the handle, and offered us a smile that felt uncomfortably practiced. He introduced himself as a lifelong mountain local who took genuine pleasure in guiding serious documentary filmmakers toward unmapped overlooks and abandoned 19th century settlements. Daniels was immediately captivated by the prospect of exclusive archival visuals, his eyes lighting up at the thought of recording landscapes no other outdoor creator had ever published. I kept my hand braced against the camera body, watching the way the old man never actually set his heavy internal frame pack on the ground while he spoke to us. He led us through 2 miles of dense timber scrub, pointing out native hemlocks with precise botanical names, while the rhythmic clack-tap of his notched stick paced our footsteps. The audio we were gathering was undeniably stunning, filled with raw valley reverberation and crisp, eerie wind sweeping through high ridges. By the middle of the second afternoon, the mountain air turned dense and cold, smelling heavily of damp granite and decaying leaf mold miles beyond any recognized emergency shelter. The guide stood at the narrow lip of a gorge, watching Daniels set up a carbon fiber tripod before turning his eyes directly into my chest pocket phone camera. His vocal tone did not drop or sharpen. It remained entirely flat, like an insurance adjuster calculating property values after a house fire. He casually asked if anyone back home had our exact GPS coordinates, or if our families were the type to contact search and rescue the moment a scheduled check-in ping failed. That was the exact second the reality of our situation fractured, exposing the predatory auditing system operating beneath his quiet hospitality. I looked into his pale gray eyes and realized he was not offering us local history. He was conducting a thorough intake assessment on our vulnerability. Daniels went motionless with his hands resting on the audio mixer, his posture locking up as the ambient noise of the woods seemed to instantly fall dead around us. My chest pocket was still capturing the entire exchange on that secondary audio file, logging every shallow breath and every dry leaf crunch under his boots. A horrific realization settled in my stomach that if we answered those evaluation questions incorrectly, we would never make it back to the highway. Instead of answering his question, I staged a sudden, irrational panic attack about a fictitious broken equipment sensor, shouting loudly about an urgent need to retrace our steps to the main trail immediately. I dropped my tripod bag into the mud, raised my voice to an embarrassing pitch, and insisted we halt all filming to consult our offline mapping units. The guide stared at me for 3 agonizing seconds, his friendly expression completely blanking, as if a light bulb had burnt out behind his eyes. He didn't argue, express concern, or attempt to calm me down. He simply stepped back into the tall ferns. He offered 2 brief, icy sentences of directional guidance toward the upper ridge line and vanished into the timber without making a single sound. We moved at a near sprint back toward the established trail corridor, our boots slamming hard against exposed roots until our lungs burned from the cold mountain air. That night, hunkered inside a crude stone shelter 3 miles away, Daniels plugged his headphones into the audio recorder while I pulled up my phone's background track. Listening to the recording through studio-grade monitors transformed the guide's pleasant chatter into a terrifying diagnostic checklist. Every casual inquiry about our posting schedule, our lease agreements, and our living arrangements was calculated to measure how much friction our disappearance would generate. We hadn't escaped because we were clever. We were rejected because I had suddenly rendered us chaotic, noisy, and high maintenance. We agreed to spend the remaining 3 days of our trip strictly on the blazed trail, keeping our gear packed light and our eyes locked on the path ahead of us. But 3 days later, while navigating a narrow shale shelf above a dried creek bed, the mountain atmosphere shifted again into an unnatural, suffocating silence. The forest birds stopped calling all at once, replaced by the synchronized metallic clack-tap of whittled wood striking shale rock up ahead. It was our guide, but he was no longer hiking alone on the mountain. 3 other older men dressed in identical worn canvas clothes walked alongside him, each carrying a whittled hickory stick carved with those same deep cross-hatched notches. Walking in single file ahead of the 4 men were 3 young women whose movements looked horrifyingly mechanical and detached from reality. They stepped over fallen timber and loose gravel with a smooth, blank rhythm, their shoulders slouched and their eyes fixed entirely on the dirt ahead of them. They wore no ropes, no physical restraints, and showed no visible signs of struggle, yet they moved like livestock being driven toward an enclosure. When the guide caught sight of us standing on the upper rock shelf, he gave a short, silent hand signal to his companions. Without a single word spoken, the 4 men guided the silent women off the marked trail and down into the dense laurel scrub, vanishing into the gray timber. Daniels never stopped pressing record. His professional instincts held the telephoto lens rock steady, even as his fingers trembled violently against the camera housing. We captured high-definition video of their faces, their notched hickory sticks, and the vacant, unblinking strides of those 3 marching women. We turned and ran, executing a brutal 4-hour forced march through untamed terrain until our feet were bleeding inside our boots and cell signal finally flickered onto our screens. Standing on the shoulder of an isolated asphalt county road, I dialed local law enforcement with numb fingers, reporting an active abduction in progress. We genuinely believed that delivering hard visual evidence to the authorities would initiate an immediate tactical search operation. At the county sheriff's station, the atmosphere was suffocatingly indifferent, smelling faintly of old floor wax and stale coffee. The duty deputy flipped through our high-resolution video files with a bored thumb, casually suggesting the women were simply exhausted hikers suffering from severe trail fatigue. When we played the secondary audio recording where the guide systematically asked about our search and rescue risk, the deputy chuckled dryly and dismissed it as friendly mountain banter. They took our names, filed a brief 2-page incident report, and strongly advised us to head home and sleep off the stress of the backcountry. It became instantly terrifying that the local authorities were not merely incompetent. They were actively managing an administrative boundary for something larger. 6 days after returning to our home office, 2 men dressed in tailored charcoal suits arrived at our door without prior notice. They presented credentials from an obscure federal oversight division, speaking in quiet, clinical tones that contained neither warmth nor overt hostility. They demanded every hard drive, every memory card, every camera body, and every cloud storage key associated with our Appalachian documentary expedition. They presented a binding non-disclosure directive, calmly reminding us that publishing or discussing any portion of the footage would result in immediate federal prosecution and total asset seizure. We handed over our master production drives, signed their paperwork, and gave our word to remain silent. What those federal agents didn't realize was that my phone's low bitrate background recording had automatically synced to an encrypted, cold storage air-gapped drive hidden beneath my floorboards. I never touched those files, never edited the audio track, and never told Daniels that a secondary copy of the trip had survived. 3 months later, a plain manila envelope bearing no return address or postmark appeared in my physical home mailbox. Inside were 40 glossy 8x10 printouts showing frame-by-frame screenshots of our original raw video footage. But among them was a final photograph that caused my lungs to seize. A crystal-clear exterior photo of my own living room window, taken at night from inside my front yard bushes. Carved directly into the oak frame of my front door was the exact pattern of cross-hatched notches from the guide's whittled hickory stick. Underneath the photograph sat a small index card featuring a single typed sentence: "You have what we need. Keep it safe." That note was not an offer of protection. It was an active surveillance contract that bound us to their silence. The entity operating in those mountains didn't merely control remote trailheads and local police dockets. They possessed unhindered access to federal agency channels and private residential homes. My hidden drive was not a secret weapon to be exposed. It was their hostage, holding our lives in perpetual escrow. Late last night, I finally mustered the courage to open that hidden ambient audio file from the afternoon we first met the guide on the trail. Isolating the high-frequency vocal spectrum from my chest pocket recording, I amplified the quiet background sound recorded while he stood leaning near my shoulder. Beneath his pleasant local voice, whispered at a pitch so low it was barely picked up by the microphone, he was reciting my full legal middle name and reading off my private home address. But the detail that will haunt me until I die was buried in the unreleased video frame of the middle captive woman as she passed beneath our ledge. For a single frame, she had glanced directly into our telephoto lens, and her dry, cracked lips were silently mouthing my mother's maiden name. Daniels and I sold our production company last month, and we no longer speak about the wilderness or the documentary channel we spent 8 years building. We live quietly in separate states, answering our phones on the first ring and keeping our blacked-out window blinds drawn tight long before sunset. The 42 hours of unreleased raw footage remain untouched beneath my floorboards, a quiet, unposted ledger of a harvest system that operates with absolute impunity. I understand now that they didn't let us walk away because we were clever or because we feigned panic on the trail. They let us live because we proved we were smart enough to keep our mouths shut, and that silence is the only reason my lungs still fill with air. The first woman I saw on that trail was walking like someone had borrowed her body and forgotten how humans move. Her arms hung straight against her sides, her boots landed at the exact same moment as the 3 women beside her, and none of them looked at the mountains around them. My name is Mara, and 7 years ago, my husband Carter and I made hiking documentaries for schools and small outdoor channels. We believed the Appalachian Trail was one of the last places where a person could still feel honestly small. We went looking for clean footage of wilderness on a remote 20-mile section near the Virginia and West Virginia border. Instead, we found 4 women being marched through the trees. Carter had spent 15 years in the backcountry. I had spent 10 teaching teenagers how not to panic when the weather turned, when the map got wet, when the trail disappeared under leaves. We carried filters, satellite communication, paper maps, extra batteries, enough food for 4 days. Before we started, Carter clipped a pale blue ribbon to the zipper of his pack so we could spot each other quickly if we got separated. It looked almost cheerful against all that green. The morning had been mild enough for a light jacket. Autumn was only beginning to touch the ridges, turning a few maples orange, while the rest of the forest stayed deep and wet-looking. Carter kept checking his GPS because it gave a soft 2-note chime every 20 minutes. Even though we were nowhere near a marked waypoint, he blamed the satellite signal. I believed him because I had spent most of our relationship believing Carter when he sounded certain. That was my weakness then. Carter was the capable one, the man with the wilderness stories and the calm voice on camera. I was the one who organized footage, built lesson plans, and worried about permits. I loved him, but I also needed him to think I was brave enough to belong beside him. We had been hiking for maybe 3 hours when I noticed a strange smell under the leaf mold and pine. It was sweet, almost pleasant at first, like apples left too long in a warm kitchen. I mentioned it, and Carter smiled without looking up from his map. Probably an old cider orchard, he said. There were no orchards on the map. The women appeared around a bend 50 yards ahead. All 4 wore white thermal shirts, white pants, and hiking boots that were too large for them. Their clothes were smeared with mud around the knees and dark stains around the cuffs. They moved in a line, shoulder to shoulder, their steps landing together with a soft, repeated crunch. Not marching. Not exactly. Marching has intention. These women looked emptied out. Their faces were slack, their eyes open wide but fixed on a point beyond the trail. When one stepped over a root, the other 3 stepped over it at the same time, even though only one of them needed to. Carter stopped so suddenly that I bumped into him. He lifted one hand without speaking, and I saw the 2 men moving through the woods behind the women. They were 50 feet off the trail, one on each side, keeping pace through thorn bushes and fallen limbs without making a sound. One of the women slowed. The man on the left raised 2 fingers. She immediately corrected herself. No shouting. No weapon that I could see. No rope around their wrists. But the woman's head snapped forward as if the gesture had been attached to a wire inside her skull. Carter pulled me behind a wall of rhododendron. The leaves were waxy and cold against my cheek. We crouched there while he took out his phone and began recording through a narrow gap in the branches. The procession passed close enough for me to hear their breathing. 4 women inhaling, 4 women exhaling, perfectly together. Then one of them turned her head toward the bushes where we hid. Her eyes met mine for less than a second. Her lips barely moved. Don't let them count you. The GPS in Carter's hand gave its little 2-note chime, and every person on the trail stopped walking. For several seconds, nobody moved. The men stood in the trees with their heads lowered, as if listening to something under the ground. The women remained on the trail, facing forward, their shoulders rising and falling in the same shallow rhythm. Then Carter's phone screen went black, not dead. Black. The woman who had spoken to me slowly lifted one hand. Around her wrist was a pale blue ribbon, tied in the same loose knot Carter had used on his pack zipper that morning. I stared at it until Carter gripped my forearm hard enough to hurt. The men had started walking again. The women followed, leaving the Appalachian Trail and moving down a narrow slope where no path should have been. We should have turned around. That is the sentence I have repeated to myself more times than I can count. We should have gone back to the trailhead, activated the emergency communicator, and told anyone who answered that something terrible was happening in those woods. But Carter looked at his dead phone, then at me, and said we needed proof, and I agreed. Because I wanted him to see that I could follow him into the dark without becoming a problem he had to manage. We stayed far behind them at first. The forest changed as we descended. The air became warmer, trapped between the hills, and that sweet apple smell thickened until it sat greasy in my throat. The ground was packed down in places, though there were no boot prints clear enough to follow. Just long dragged marks through the leaves, as if heavy objects had been pulled uphill. Carter's GPS had no signal now. Still, every 20 minutes it chimed. Each time it did, the women stopped. Each time, one of the men made a hand signal. I began to notice that they were not leading the women. They were responding to them, watching their posture, measuring the space between their shoulders, correcting tiny mistakes. Like instructors or handlers, we reached a ravine near midday. From above, it looked natural, a gash in the earth hidden by boulders, roots, and thick brush. But the deeper we looked, the more wrong it became. Someone had lined parts of the ravine with boards and camouflage netting. There were water containers stacked under a tarp, blankets, plastic bins, and 6 pairs of women's boots arranged neatly beside a stone wall. There were only 4 women with us. Carter raised his camera again. I caught his wrist. "What are you doing?" I whispered. He looked offended by the question. "Documenting." That word had always sounded noble to me. In that ravine, it sounded hungry. One of the men guided the women toward a narrow opening between 2 rocks. They vanished below the surface one at a time. The last woman, the one who had spoken to me, looked back again. This time she did not look vacant. She looked terrified. Then someone crawled out of the brush behind us. I heard the wet scrape of palms against leaves before I saw her. She was a young woman, maybe late 20s, with mud in her hair and one side of her face swollen purple. Her jacket had been torn nearly off one shoulder. She tried to speak, but only air came out. Carter moved toward her first. "My name is Sarah," she whispered after we got water into her. "I got away." Her voice was broken into pieces. She said she had been hiking alone. She said someone had offered help. After she hurt her ankle, she remembered a warm drink that smelled like apples. She remembered waking underground with women she did not know. Then she looked directly at Carter. "They make you practice," she said. He went still. "They make you walk together. They make you answer when they ring the thing. They tell you that if you do it right, you can go home." Carter asked how many men there were. Sarah began crying so quietly that at first I thought she was laughing. "It isn't just men," she said. "That is what they want you to think." From somewhere below us came the soft 2-note chime. Carter's GPS was in his hand. Sarah slapped it away so violently that it hit a tree trunk and cracked open. Inside the casing, where the battery should have been, there was a small black disc wrapped in silver wire. Carter had never seen it before. At least, that is what he said. The ravine answered with voices, not shouts, not search calls, a group of people calmly repeating the same phrase from below the earth. Count them, count them, count them. Sarah grabbed my sleeve. They know you watched. Then, from the trees behind us, someone said my name, not loudly, the way Carter said it when we were filming, and he wanted me to smile for the camera. Mara. We ran without choosing a direction. Sarah stumbled between us, and Carter kept trying to guide us uphill, but the trees seemed to repeat themselves. The same split oak, the same gray boulder shaped like a kneeling animal, the same patch of mushrooms crushed into the dirt. Every time we passed it, the apple smell got stronger. Behind us, nobody chased. That was worse. There were no crashing footsteps, no threats, no voices calling Sarah back. Just the quiet confidence of people who knew the woods better than we did. People who knew where every exit led. After what felt like an hour, we burst onto the Appalachian Trail near an old shelter. An older hiker was sitting at the picnic table, eating trail mix from a metal cup. He looked up at us with mild irritation, as though we had interrupted his lunch. Carter activated our satellite communicator. The man watched us explain about Sarah, the ravine, the women in white, the men in the trees. When I mentioned the blue ribbons, his expression changed, only for a second. Then he said, "You two are lucky you found the trail again." The rescue team arrived after dark. They took Sarah to a hospital. They interviewed us separately for hours. Carter gave them his video. I gave them the broken GPS device. I told them about the chime, the woman's warning, the enclosure underground. The detective taking my statement wrote everything down except one detail. When I said the women had been walking in perfect synchronization, he stopped his pen and looked at me strangely. Then he asked, "How do you know?" I told him I saw them. He said, "No." "How do you know they were women?" I did not understand until later. The footage Carter recovered from his phone showed the trail ahead of us. It showed the 4 white figures. It showed the 2 men in the trees, but every face was blurred by a pale vertical smear, like rain on glass, including mine. In the final minute of video after the procession left the trail, the camera swung toward the rhododendron where we had hidden. Carter was crouched there alone. He was whispering to someone just outside the frame. "Yes," he said, "she will follow me." The investigation ended 6 days later. Sarah disappeared from the hospital before she could give a formal statement. Her room was empty, her records missing, her name absent from the visitor log. The detective told us there was no evidence a patient named Sarah had ever been admitted. Carter and I stopped making documentaries. We moved 3 states away. We did not hike again. For a while, we did not speak about the trail at all. Then I found the blue ribbon. It was tied around the zipper of my winter coat. I had not worn that coat on the hike. I had bought it 2 years later, in a mall outside Columbus, and the ribbon was faded from weather as though it had spent years in the woods. When I untied it, there was dirt trapped in the knot, and a smell like old apples. I confronted Carter that night. He did not deny putting it there. He just sat at our kitchen table, staring at his hands, and told me something I had never known about him. When he was 19, he had gotten lost on the same stretch of trail for 2 nights. He remembered a group finding him. He remembered being warm, fed, and led back to safety. He remembered nothing else. But sometimes, he said, I hear the chime. That was when I understood why he had wanted proof so badly, why he had followed those women instead of helping them, why he had looked so certain when he said we should keep going. He had not been leading me into danger. He had been returning to it 3 months after we separated. A padded envelope arrived at my apartment with no return address. Inside was a printed photograph from Carter's documentary camera. It showed 4 women in white walking down an autumn trail. I recognized the first 3. The 4th woman had my face. Her arms hung straight at her sides. Her eyes were open, fixed on something far ahead. Around her wrist was the pale blue ribbon, and behind her, just beyond the trees, I could see Carter watching. The first woman I saw on that trail was walking like someone had borrowed her body. Now, when the chime wakes me at night, I am no longer sure it gave it back. I've spent 12 years believing that everything in this world could be understood, measured, and fixed. I don't believe that anymore. That change began on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when my GPS unit failed in a way that should have been impossible. I'm a GPS technician for a telecommunications company. I travel to remote locations throughout Appalachia to install, calibrate, and maintain positioning systems. The work is solitary. I spend my days in forests and on hilltops, working with sophisticated technology in places that have no cell service, no human contact, and no infrastructure beyond the natural terrain. I'm meticulous. I follow protocols. I document everything. And I had never encountered a situation that could not be explained by logical technical troubleshooting. That Tuesday, I was driving through eastern Kentucky, moving from one installation site to another. My destination was approximately 40 miles away. The route was well established, documented on every mapping system I had access to, and relatively straightforward. I was driving through rural mountains along roads that ranged from paved county highways to gravel forest service roads. The sky was clear. The radio was playing. It was an ordinary day. Approximately halfway to my destination, my GPS unit lost all satellite signal. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. The forest canopy in these mountains sometimes creates dead zones so dense that satellite signals cannot penetrate. I switched to my backup unit. That unit also showed zero signal. I pulled over to check my equipment. Both units appeared to be functioning correctly. Their internal diagnostics indicated no hardware issues, but both units were showing the same anomalous readings. They were displaying coordinates that placed me at a location that did not appear on any of my mapping software. The coordinates were consistently impossible. They placed me approximately 15 miles south of my actual location, in a geographic position that, according to every map I could access, was in the middle of a continuous forest. No roads, no structures, no reason for any roads to exist. I drove forward, assuming the GPS systems were experiencing temporary interference. I would recalibrate them once I passed through the dead zone. As I drove, the landscape began to change in subtle ways. The road I was following seemed to deteriorate more than the typical degradation I expected. The trees seemed to close in tighter. The forest became denser. I noticed the air smelled different, heavier, older, like damp soil and decaying leaves that had not been disturbed in a very long time. Then I noticed something that made me pull over. The road I was following was not on my map, not on any of my maps. I consulted my physical paper maps, my phone mapping applications, my vehicle's original factory navigation system. None of them showed this road. None of them showed this location. I decided to stop trying to navigate by external systems and simply drive back the way I came. I turned the vehicle around, but as I drove back, something became clear. The landscape did not match my recollection of the route I had just traveled. The trees were arranged differently. The curves in the road were in unexpected locations. The road I was on seemed to narrow as I drove, the forest pressing closer on both sides, the branches reaching toward my windows like they were trying to touch the glass. After 15 minutes of driving, I recognized that I was lost. Genuinely lost, in a landscape that seemed deliberately designed to prevent navigation. The roads seemed to shift and change as I drove. I attempted to use my cell phone to call for help. No signal. I attempted to reach the telecommunications company office on my CB radio. No response. My GPS units continued showing coordinates that placed me in impossible locations. I was a man who fixed navigation systems for a living. I was a man who had never been lost in my entire professional career, and I was lost in a way that made no sense. I drove forward blindly, following roads that existed but did not appear on any mapping system I possessed. The forest grew darker. The road grew rougher, and then I came upon the holler. The holler emerged from the forest suddenly, as if the dense wood simply stopped and opened into a valley that should not have existed. I saw structures through the trees, multiple buildings, all of them partially hidden by undergrowth and deliberate camouflage. The structures appeared old, built from natural materials, and arranged with no apparent regard for any building codes or municipal planning standards. I could see people moving between the buildings. They wore clothing that appeared decades out of date. They moved with a sluggishness that suggested either great age or profound exhaustion, or something else I could not identify. I drove slowly through the holler, my heart rate accelerating with every second. The people I saw did not react to my vehicle. They simply continued their activities with complete indifference to my presence. I saw a woman hanging clothing on a line constructed between two trees. I saw a man carrying what appeared to be a freshly killed deer. I saw children, pale and thin, moving between structures with a slowness that matched the movements of the adults. Nobody acknowledged my presence. Nobody looked at me. It was as if my vehicle moving through their space was invisible to them. I was close enough to see their faces clearly. Their expressions were blank, not hostile, not curious, just empty, like they had forgotten how to react to anything outside their routines. As I drove deeper into the holler, I became aware of something else. The buildings contained artifacts. Visible through windows and open doorways were objects that seemed impossible to explain. Photographs covered the interior walls of several structures. Hundreds of photographs tacked up and arranged in patterns. I could not see clearly from my vehicle, but the photographs appeared to show people. Many people, arranged in groups. I noticed the road through the holler was not gravel or dirt. It was packed earth, worn smooth by countless feet over countless years. The buildings had no electrical wires, no satellite dishes, no antennas, no modern infrastructure of any kind. It was like driving through a photograph from 100 years ago. Then I saw something that compelled me to stop. Mounted on the exterior wall of one of the larger buildings were items that looked disturbingly like highway signs. Actual traffic signs, the kind that mark routes and distances. Multiple signs, all of them pointing in different directions, all of them bearing route numbers and destination names. But the destination names were not real places. They were locations that did not exist on any map. I read the signs as I drove past, trying to commit them to memory. Coordinates to nowhere. Directions to impossible places. The signs looked weathered and old, but they had been deliberately maintained, their surfaces clean and legible. I drove through that holler as quickly as I dared without driving completely recklessly. As I emerged on the other side, the forest closed in again. The dense woods returned, and when I looked in my mirror, the holler had disappeared behind me. Within minutes of driving away from it, I could no longer see the structures or the people or any evidence of habitation. The holler had vanished. When I finally reached a location where my cell phone picked up signal, I immediately called my office. I reported the GPS equipment failures. I reported being lost. I asked for assistance triangulating my location. Using cell phone tower signals, my office was able to determine my actual position. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, approximately 3 miles from my scheduled destination. My vehicle had never deviated from the expected route. That was impossible. I had driven for 40 minutes in directions that did not match any mapped roads. I had entered a holler that I could describe in detail. I had seen people, buildings, signs, evidence of habitation. But according to every external source of information available, I had driven in a straight line along an established road without ever deviating or getting lost. I completed my scheduled installation and drove home. I did not sleep that night. I kept replaying the drive in my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. I could not find one. The next day, I contacted the county mapping office in the area where I'd gotten lost. I provided them with a description of the holler, the location where I believed it to be, and the specific coordinates my GPS had shown before the signal became impossibly inconsistent. The county official I spoke with became quiet when I described the location. He asked me to repeat the coordinates. He asked me to describe the landscape more specifically. Then he told me something that made my skin cold. He said that several years earlier, a hiker had reported finding a holler in that same general area that did not appear on any official maps. The hiker had reported seeing structures and people. The hiker had reported strange signage pointing to non-existent locations. The hiker had reported that when he tried to photograph evidence, his camera malfunctioned and all photographs were corrupted. The hiker had reported the location to authorities. But when searches were conducted, no evidence of the holler or any structures could be found. The county official told me that the hiker's report was in an old file, largely forgotten because it had seemed unreliable. But he said that my detailed description matched the hiker's account so precisely that he did not believe in coincidence. I drove back to that location 1 week later. I attempted to locate the holler again. I drove down the same road looking for the landscape changes that would indicate the location where I had become lost. I could not find it. The road was exactly where it should have been. The forest was exactly where it should have been. There was no valley. There was no holler. There was no evidence that anything I had experienced had ever existed. I drove that route 3 more times over the course of 2 months. Each time, I was looking for something that I knew I had experienced, but that every logical system insisted could not exist. Each time, the drive was ordinary, unremarkable. The road was straight. The forest was dense. There was no anomaly. During my last attempt to find the holler, I noticed something that terrified me. A package was sitting on the seat of my vehicle when I returned from my day of searching. Nobody had entered my vehicle. It was locked, but the package was there. Inside the package were photographs. Dozens of photographs. Photographs of me. Photographs taken from angles that made clear I was being watched. Photographs of me driving. Photographs of me at gas stations. Photographs of me at my apartment. Photographs of me at my office. Recent photographs, some taken within days of receiving the package. The photographs showed me at the gas station near my apartment. They showed me buying groceries. They showed me standing in my driveway. They showed me through my kitchen window at night. I looked at those photographs and realized that I had been watched for weeks without knowing it. The camera had been close. The photographer had been close. The photographs were accompanied by a note. The note contained the license plate number of my vehicle, my home address, and a single sentence. The sentence said simply, "You found the way in. You know not to find it again." I no longer drive through eastern Kentucky. I have requested transfer to a different service region. I have not driven down that particular road again. I have not attempted to locate the holler. I do not know if the holler is actually a place that can be located, or if it exists in some space between mapping systems, visible only to those who become lost in the right way at the right time. What I do know is that someone or something in that holler now knows exactly who I am and where I live. That knowledge exists whether the holler itself is real or imaginary. That knowledge is permanent. I still have those photographs. I keep them in a drawer in my bedroom. I do not know why I keep them. I look at them sometimes trying to understand. The photographs of me through my kitchen window show my face clearly. I can see the expression I was wearing in that moment. I look normal, ordinary, unaware. But sometimes, when I look at those photographs, I notice something strange. The photographs were taken from close range. The angles are sharp. The subjects are clear. The photographer was skilled. But in the photographs of me at my kitchen window, I can see my reflection in the glass. And behind my reflection in the darkness of my own kitchen, there is a shape, a figure, standing still. Watching me, I have searched my memory. I have tried to remember if there was anyone in my kitchen during those moments. I have never found anyone. I have never found evidence of anyone. But the shape is there, in every photograph. A figure standing in my kitchen, just beyond the reach of the camera's focus, present in every image, but never quite clear enough to identify. The day I received that package, I locked my doors and checked every room. I searched my apartment. I searched my closets. I searched my basement. I found nothing. I found no one. But I could not escape the feeling that I was not alone, that I had never been alone, that someone had been in my kitchen, that someone had been standing in the darkness, watching me, waiting for me to find the way in and the way back. I made a logical choice. I stopped searching. I requested a transfer. I moved on. But I made that choice not because I believed the logical explanation. I made it because I received photographic evidence that I was being surveilled by something that existed beyond the reach of any mapping system or technological device I possessed. And I understood that the only way to remain safe was to accept the impossible. I have spent 12 years believing that everything could be understood, measured, and fixed. I don't believe that anymore, but sometimes, late at night, I take out those photographs. I look at the shape in my kitchen. I try to see if it has moved between photographs. I try to measure its distance from the camera. I try to understand what it wanted from me. And I wonder if the holler was not a place I stumbled into, but a threshold I was invited to cross. I wonder if those signs on the wall of that building were not markers for lost travelers. I wonder if they were warnings. I wonder if my name was on one of those signs, written in a language I could not read, pointing toward a destination I could not map. The message was clear. Certain places do not want to be found. Certain routes do not want to be mapped. And certain people do not want witnesses to their existence. I made the logical choice by stopping my search. But the truth is, I did not stop because I wanted to. I stopped because I understood that the holler was not lost. I was the one who was lost, and the people in that holler knew exactly where I was. They had always known, they still do.